So, Peter, thank you again for doing this interview with us. Maybe you can begin by introducing yourself a little bit.
Sure. So my name is Peter Hammer. I'm a professor of law here at Wayne State University Law School and director of the Damon J Center for Civil Rights.
So, the topic of our conversation today is primarily going to be around water security issues in Detroit. What does water security mean to you?
Yeah. So language matters. And so we've had a concerted effort to try to be talking about clean, safe, affordable water. So in my mind, I would associate notions of water security and water insecurity around that broader frame of trying to seek out and obtain clean, safe, affordable water.
So clean, safe, and affordable. When we're talking about safety, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so I mean, you can start to see this opens up a whole bunch of issues. So you think about Flint, the Flint water was unsafe on multiple dimensions. So you're talking about purities and impurities and contaminants. You're thinking about affordable, you have the sort of income component. So those are some of the thoughts to go into. And basically, you're beginning with a premise that the water is essential for life, right? And that water needs to be holistically available, which means that it's got to be of sufficient quality, it's got to be safe, it's got to be clean, and it's got to be within the range of what people can actually afford.
Could you put this in maybe some historical perspective for us, given your work looking at how this has been percolating over the past few years? Maybe talk a little bit about the water distribution system that has been existing in Southeast Michigan and Detroit for the past few decades, and when you see this sort of being a problem or a security concern or a concern for residents in general.
Yeah. The water system goes way back beyond a few decades. I mean, so you're really talking about the inception of the water system, which was in Detroit, right, owned by Detroit. And over the years, Detroit actually subsidized the growth of the region, which in retrospect was subsidizing its own demise. So the growth of the water system is coterminous with the growth of the region. But even though it is a region-wide footprint, it is still historically, well, I should say was historically owned and controlled by the city of Detroit. And therefore, the fight over water reflected the greater fight over race and regionalism within the broader sector. So it's like any string that you start pulling, right? You can't pull any string in Detroit without getting to what I call the 3 R's of race, regionalism, and reconciliation, right? And they're all intertwined. So a fight over water is a fight over power, and it's that tells you why the sort of Judge Fikens of the Eastern District of Michigan federal court was basically the water czar for 3 decades. That it's water is life, but water is also power and politics.
Could you elaborate on the Fikens verdict and the Fikens rule a little bit
more? And to be honest, I don't understand, right? and not because I'm not capable of understanding, but it started out as a violation of the Federal Clean Water Act, right, which I do understand. And then it morphed into a parallel system of government in which the trial judge, Judge Fikens, was overseeing it, but was really creating an alternative shadow form of government, which was giving the region all sorts of control over what was a Detroit asset, and removing the kind of exclusive of control over the asset from the city of Detroit. So how it morphs into that, which has no statutory authority, which has no life and federal mandate, that's what I don't understand. So the suit that began as a clean water violation, environmental protection, right, became a system of regional governance that had none of the qualities of governance that you would want, which would be transparency, accountability, legitimacy, and democracy.
And this was when, in the
Started in the 1970s, right? And it ended magically days before the emergency manager and the bankruptcy. Right? So this whole faux governance system that prevented Detroit from actually having ownership and control over the asset disappeared magically just as we were putting another system of control and emergency management and federal bankruptcy under this Detroit, which also robbed the citizens of Detroit from its democratic rights. And through that process spun out the Great Lakes Water Authority, which in my opinion has really been the theft, the regional theft of a Detroit asset.
And that ruling is generally the progenitor of the whole 83-17 rule.
All these things get tied into part, but that was from that era, right? So you say, well, what happened in that era? One of the things that happened in that era was judicial determination of the cost allocation of a particular part of the water system and water structure.
So, you know, a dominant narrative from that event and from that ruling is basically that, you know, Detroiters basically screwed up the system, screwed up their ownership of the system, and so they can be trusted with ownership of the system, and so that's why we need to have regionalism. How would you counter the narrative? Because that is the narrative that is almost pushed in a lot of these circuits.
You know, if that's the narrative, we first call it out as being overtly racist as it is, right? Judge Fikens got into a lot of trouble in the very beginning because he basically said that black people weren't sophisticated enough to run a water system, right? So the narrative certainly has a checkered history. The irony, which kind of disproves the narrative amongst other lines, is that Detroit hasn't controlled the water system since Judge Fikens took it over, right? So if there was mismanagement, if there are problems, you should be heading straight to federal court and the federal judiciary, because the irony is that Detroit hasn't had control. And anybody who's lived in the city of Detroit has also heard that story, not just about water, but about everything. And what it does, it becomes a convenient excuse for people who left the city decades ago to continue this kind of racialized narrative. So, I mean, the root cause of the water problem, and it's the same root cause of the educational crisis and the housing crisis, is this notion of spatial structural racism. And if you're not starting to sort of center the discussion around notions of spatial structural racism, and then start to see how that predetermines, right, these issues of race, regionalism, and reconciliation, then you're chasing your tail. Right, and it's a complicated story, so it's not something that's sort of an easy thing you sort of roll up and get immediately. But if you're not putting it in that frame, right, and any racialized system needs racialized narratives to maintain it, right? And the kind of entry question you gave was sort of the racialized narrative that exists to perpetuate this racial hierarchy built upon water in this instance, but grounded in these notions of spatial structural racism.
Peter, so. You know, you mentioned race, regionalism, and reconciliation. Race is not straightforward, by no means. But let's focus first on the other two concepts you mentioned, regionalism and reconciliation, because by themselves, these notions are not necessarily problematic or bad. But can you tell us a little bit about how you see both regionalism and reconciliation being sort of morphed or manipulated in this particular context?
Yeah, so the beginning, I think that race, regionalism, and reconciliation becomes a framework to think about issues in Detroit, but have aspirational elements as well. I think everybody would benefit from a healthier sense of regionalism, but you have to get over the racial divides, the inequality, if you're going to get that. So they're also interconnected. And I also look at reconciliation as an aspirational goal. Right? It may be intergenerational. But you can't start that if you don't begin to at least think through what is the history of racism and white flight that created this dysfunctional, divided region, how the water system is reflective of that fractured, dysfunctional nature, and that if we can't address that history, we can't even begin to think about what reconciliation would look like. Right? And there are healthier models. I mean, what I would say you should be aspiring to have in the metro area is a form of regional revenue sharing, right? which reflects where wealth was originally created, where wealth was transferred from, right, and where inequality persists, right? And Minneapolis and St. Paul have a regional revenue sharing system that makes sure that the system and the region itself, which is the economic unit, Wayne County and Oakland County and Macomb County are not economic systems. It's the Detroit metro area's economic system, maintains a vibrant economic system that is more just, right? And at the beginning of the bankruptcy process, Poncella Hardaway at Moses and John Powell at the Haas Institute and I wrote a piece that was calling for what I call now a grander bargain, right? So if you look at the footprint of the historic Detroit Water and Sewer Department, you have a footprint that is region-wide, right? And a footprint that is owned by the city of Detroit, right? What is bankruptcy supposed to do? It's supposed to break contracts, right? And we were advocating that we should go in through the bankruptcy process and break all of the wholesale contracts with all of these townships and municipalities, renegotiate them, and we would have an implicit system of regional revenue sharing. So you could have taken the water system, reimagined what it would look like through a lens of racial equity, and actually have a form of regionalism that would be building towards that Minneapolis and St. Paul model that would have an embedded system of regional revenue sharing through the water system. Now you say, well, that would require changes in state law. Well, we needed charges in state law for the grand bargain, right? But nobody could even imagine a grander bargain, right? Nobody could even imagine an equitable way to be using this water resource in a way that would make the water system itself sustainable, but make the broader social, economic, political, regional footprint sustainable.
What was the response to that
Silence.
piece?
Silence. Right? Nobody wants to, but it's important you put that out there because then they can't say, well, we couldn't think of anything else. Right? And it becomes something that you have a means of comparison. The Great Lakes Water Authority, through the analysis that we do at the Key Center, just like the Flint KWA pipeline and the root causes of the Flint water crisis, are examples of what we call strategic racism. Right? And strategic racism is the conscious manipulation for public or private gain of the historic forces of structural racism, intentional discrimination, and forms of implicit bias. So magically, right, just as I said that nobody can understand why Judge Fikens could control the water system for decades, well, magically, the bankruptcy system wants to then embrace the water system, right? And then magically, out of that bankruptcy process, without any accountability, legitimacy, transparency, or democracy, you have the creation of the Great Lakes Water Authority. And in my mind, that is another example of the manipulation of historical structural racism, right, for the gain of the region, right? And so I think it's appropriate to think about the Great Lakes Water Authority as an example of the theft of the Detroit Water and Sewer Department, right, and not an example of a form of authentic type of regionalism.
How did you enter this context? Were you practicing law at that stage? Were you with Wayne State? So can you describe a little bit?
Yeah, so the water crisis, the bankruptcy emergency management of all unfolded, after the Key Center was up and running. The Key Center focuses on structural racism as our generation's civil rights challenge. And through a methodology then of structural racism, you look at the pressing issues of the city, right? So one of the first things we looked at was the Detroit Future City report, right? And use that very simple template of race, regionalism, and reconciliation as a framework to do a critique of Detroit Future City. And it was a near completely ahistorical document that looked at the problems of the city and the future of the city without any analysis of structural racism, right? Any analysis of white flight, any analysis of segregated housing policies, right? And I may be naive, but I tell my students that if you don't understand the nature of the problem, it's very hard to know what the solution is. And yet this entire 360-page document tried to imagine 50 years of the future of Detroit without thinking about race, right? If you look at the Detroit Future City maps, right, almost all of the maps show Detroit in isolation. So it's a map that shows the footprint of the city of Detroit, doesn't even have a name for Oakland County, right? Doesn't have a name or a representation for Wayne County. All of this is sort of this white space, right, with completely non-representation. Ironically, one of the few maps that is in there, a couple of maps are worth noting, the map of the water table shows the region. and not the city, because water flows beyond these imaginary boundaries. There's a map of migratory bird patterns, right? And that shows the city not isolated from the region. And there's a map of the Detroit Water and Sewer Department, right? And that shows the region because the water system was regional, right? So what we do here is develop an analysis of structural racism, apply that to Detroit Future City, the collapsing state policies that have contributed to the failure of the public school system, and then emergency management, right? And then bankruptcy, and then water shutoffs, and then tax foreclosures, and then community benefits and other forms of equitable development, right? But the great thing about structural racism as a methodology is it's de-siloing, right? It breaks down those silos and show all of these issues are fundamentally interconnected, right? And if we don't see the interconnection, if we don't ground it in that history of spatial structural racism, we can't even begin to imagine what a just water system would look like, right? What a just education system would look like, or what a just regional governance system would look like.
You're talking about de-siloing, and one of the advantages that I think we've been finding with the notion of water security is that it does help us connect situations like affordability issues, contamination issues, with problems of access and infrastructure failure, for instance. From a structural racism perspective, how would you connect all of these different issues? Because it's so strange because we're suffering from problems of scarcity, extreme scarcity, but extreme excess. Also, if you think of flooding as extreme excess, for instance.
There are different ways, right? There's another way we look at a construct of race, rates, and infrastructure, right? And it's important to try to make these things concrete. So you can look at municipal distress as archaeological evidence of structural racism, right? You can actually look at some of the failures of the infrastructure, right? And the unequal nature of the infrastructure where you have an older, aged part, right? And you say, well, what's the demography and the history of that part? And a newer, cleaner, better design, just out of historical accidents one is made, that is not stuck in a combined water sewer sort of template and footprint. So this notion of trying to think through something like an infrastructure for water and how that overlays this notion of structural racism, I think is a helpful way to start building these intuitions and thinking about that. Then how does that get reflected in rates, right? I think back to this notion of the construction of the Great Lakes Water Authority, anytime that you are maintaining these imaginary geopolitical constructs as the basis of rate making, you are guaranteeing that you are preserving the legacy of structural racism, right? So the minute you tie it to geography, right, you are tying it to this legacy of structural racism. And another great illustration that at least Detroiters understand is of auto insurance rates, right? Auto insurance rates, I have a geographic unit. They incorporate that legacy of spatial structural racism, and then it's no great mystery why Detroit has the highest auto insurance rates of the state and in many parts of the nation. If you now have this regional template for the water system, and you're still preserving this balkanized system of townships and municipalities, you're also perpetuating this legacy of spatial structural racism, right? So if you just imagine something different, what if we looked at the entire footprint of the Detroit Water and Sewer Department historically, or the Great Lakes Water Authority, as a single rate base, right? And then calculate our rates based upon that, right? There's all sorts of ways that you can be imagining and reimagining how we do business as usual. And until we're ready to sort of break those systems apart, think in new ways under a lens of racial equity as our guide. This is not so you're just breaking things up and changing things just willy-nilly. You do it with the very intentionality of trying to eliminate historical forms of inequality, create equal access to opportunity, and ensure that everybody, right, has access to clean, safe, affordable water.
I mean, it goes back to what you were talking about earlier with racism being strategic. So the efforts to dismantle that also need to be equally, if not more, strategic.
And you have to talk openly about power, right? So say, why did Judge Fikens have the court system all that time? Because the regional power structure wanted it, right? And the regional power structure would then able to use that system, which had its origin in a legitimate understanding of a violation of the Clean Water Act, and morph and maintain it basically into a shadow governance system. Right, because that was in the interest of the regional power structure. The regional power structure got the Great Lakes Water Authority spun out strategically from the Detroit bankruptcy because that's what the regional power structure wanted. Right, so it is about power. Right, and if you're going to change power systems, you have to be equally strategic, but you also have to map where that power is. You have to sort of think about how you're going to intervening, and then what are the sets of strategies and tactics that can be used to change that unequal distribution and try to be implementing more equitable forms of distribution of resources and opportunity.
So, I'm not a legal scholar, but it was so from a lay perspective, I guess. A question that immediately comes to my mind is, was Judge Viking's ruling challenged, or was it not challenged, or what was why was it not challenged?
Yeah.
If it wasn't. So.
Because it reflected a regional consensus, and parts of Detroit were buying into that as well. Right, so it's things get complicated.
Okay.
Right? But the fact that it could be challenged, and the fact that it's not the only way that one could have managed that, in my mind, is proven by how quickly it was unwound. Right, when it was in the regional power structure's desire not to have that subject, right, to this whole structure, because that complicates the law, remove the federal apparatus and make this a freestanding asset, right, could then be churned through the machinery of Chapter 9 bankruptcy. Right, so again, the changes, right, of governance regimes are telling you, right, important times of the changes of strategic objectives of those that are in a position to determine the power structure. Right? In the same way, it's linked to water, but a different story. Nobody focuses on when emergency management ended in Flint. Right? We all know when it started, and that's a very important story. But emergency management ended in Flint at the height of the crisis over the lead. Right, and it ended because it was no longer in the interest of the state to be the one holding the bag in Flint. Right, so the amount of debt that existed at the time emergency management was declared over in Flint and responsibility was given back to the democracy and the citizens of Flint was almost the exact same amount of debt that existed at the time emergency management was declared and the state took control. Right, so this changes of governance structures tells you a lot, and it's important to look at when they're created. But just as in Flint and at the end of the consent decree process in the Detroit Water and Sewer Department, equally important to be thoughtful and analytical about when these structures end as well.
Do you think the stories of emergency management and water concerns in Flint and Detroit are connected?
Through many different ways. I mean, the underlying spatial structural racism that created the archaeological evidence of that structural racism and the municipal distress that was the predicate of the opportunistic declaration of emergency management is almost identical in Flint and Detroit. Right, so that part is similar. Right, it gets even more complicated in you sort of why this KWA pipeline, right, and why pitting Detroit versus Flint, right, in the context of the politics of Flint. When you realize two things: one is it's the same water system, right? Both are under a system of emergency management. Both are reporting up through Treasury and up through the governor. Right, so why there wasn't a unitary analysis of what's the best thing for the entire water unit, right? And some people argue, and I think it's a legitimate claim to be taken seriously, that Flint defecting from the Detroit water and sewer system was intended to weaken the Detroit water and sewer system, right, at a critical point that might enable various forms of regionalism, right? What they didn't realize is that the asset could be stolen much easier and much quicker, right, without having to go through a prolonged way of weakening the internal structure.
So, I'm going to ask you to think back and reflect. Bankruptcy, emergency management happened actually not that long ago. About
5 years.
5 years ago. I'm going to ask you to think back to your experience and your reflections around that time when this was really sort of unfolding around you. what were you doing? What were you thinking? What was your, who were you talking with? Who were you engaging with? How were you responding to all of these developments around you?
Yeah. The thinking was, what a humanitarian crisis. Right? What kind of civilized, sort of state would be having these mass water shutoffs? Right? I have a public health background, right? And from a public health perspective, clean water and sanitation did more to advance life expectancy than anything else in human history, right? And when the special rapporteur from the UN for housing and water were here, one of their observations was that they had never, right, in their lives, seen a society that had solved that problem of water and sanitation remove it from its citizens. Right? Around the globe, people are struggling mightily, right, to have a clean water system, to have sanitation. Nobody shuts that off to its citizens. Right? So just from its genesis, there's a deep and profound notion of what a humanitarian crisis, what inequity, what inhumanity lies with this, and what thoughtlessness, right? Given the way that data was collected and understood, they only collected the address data, right? They had no idea how many people lived in the house. They had no idea if they were elderly or medically disabled or children. So this notion, I'm just going to start turning off that key that delivers water to this house, was done in a completely blind way that was willfully ignorant, right, and denying of the humanity that is happening on the other side of that faucet, right? So it didn't take long for anybody to understand what was at stake, right? The question is, well, how do you act against that? And Detroit is full of amazingly creative, talented, bright activists, right? I mean, and the water crisis wasn't new. I mean, the water crisis is coming after issues of affordability and shutoffs that are going a decade earlier, and the pioneers of that day were creating water affordability plans, right? Of sliding scale, income-based ways to redesign both how much revenue you get and have one of these few win-win scenarios where under their water affordability plan, you got both more revenue and more justice, right? Those same creative people were coming together and trying to then use the bankruptcy process, right, to try to make a motion for an injunction, and creatively trying to get testimony, and trying to get the district court judge basically to be saying, if you are the czar, right, and de facto you are the czar, well, the czar should be worried about public health, right? The czar should be worried about the underlying impact that these processes have on people, not just their lives and livelihood, but their lives themselves. And that was an amazingly creative but ultimately non-effective mechanism, right? The creativity and the strategy to bring the UN here as witnesses to the crisis going on in Detroit was mind-blowingly significant, right? And yet it falls on deaf ears at City Hall, right? And indeed is looked at disdainfully, right? That human rights don't apply in the United States, right? That we're much better than that. At the same time, you're basically living without any democracy, right? Having fiscal austerity imposed as a matter of federal law, and having people having their basic needs to water being taken off. Right? So, as I said, the need was obvious, the creativity, the energy, the action was all of there, and yet it keeps hitting this wall, and the policy today has not changed. Right? After tens of thousands, 100,000s of residents having their water shut off, the policy is still the same.
Did you attend the rapporteur's town hall forums?
Yeah, so I was on the listening panel, right? So I was also hearing the stories as the special rapporteur was hearing the stories of people's water being shut off.
Can you describe or reflect what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, I mean, the narratives matter, right? Telling these stories are important. But there's also an irony, because everybody knows the story, right? So there's this kind of notion that we're going through a ritual, and rituals can be important, But we're also, just as in the irony of Flint was, the minute that they switched to the Flint water, the minute the water came out looking like iced tea, right, and smelling like crap, you knew there was something wrong in the water, right? But it wasn't until we found lead, and lead in violation of specific federal statutes, that we could act, right? So there's this interesting kind of way in which power and knowledge and narrative and what moves systems and what doesn't move system, because it wasn't a lack of knowledge that water is essential to life, right? Everybody's told as a kid that you can live longer without food than you can without water. And yet we need to go through these rituals. We need to create these theater, right? And sometimes to good effect, sometimes not to not good effect, but not effective in changing policies. But it was very effective in terms of really letting people tell their stories, which is important, exposing this to an international audience that could then reflect that back to a power structure in a way that's very different than the kind of bottom-up advocacy that we often have to rely upon. And there's dignity in hearing people's stories, right? But that dignity fades pretty quickly when the policy doesn't change.
Another, I think, really high-profile legal event, at least around that time, was the Humry trials. Again, I know you were involved during that time as well. Could you maybe again reflect and recount your experiences during that time?
Yeah, and I wasn't directly involved in the legal work, so I want to give credit and due to the great lawyers who were doing that work. But what happens is you kind of just keep going through, well, that didn't work, right? What tools do we have, right? And there's a notion James Scott has of calling about the weapons of the weak, right? And so you're going through what is left, right? And tools of civil disobedience, right, are there, and those are time-honored tools, and many of the people who really kind of put their bodies on the line had long histories and traditions of that kind of fight, right, and that kind of tradition of fighting, and they stood up, right, and stood for what was right, right. And then they have the whole force of the state coming down, right? The state that won't think creatively about putting on water is going to make sure that we're going to teach these people a lesson, right? Until it looks like they're actually going to win, and then we'll just sort of pull the carpet out of the proceedings. So it's an interesting story on many different dimensions. Certainly the courage of the people who did it, the importance of the legal team and the legal support that was given, and the pushback they were getting from the state, and the tortured kind of legal rulings that seemed to be produced the longer this trial seemed to go forward. But one key part that people don't necessarily focus on was how important it was to the defendants, right, to have a jury trial, right? And part of a tradition of a jury is embedded in traditions of democracy. And we don't often sort of think about the jury from a democratic lens, but historically that was very important. And especially in a city that's in emergency management that has a huge democratic deficit, that notion of a jury and civil disobedience is really a call for jury nullification, right? A call for the citizens, right, to act through this democratic means and institution in ways to say those laws are unjust and we will not enforce those laws, right? But then again, creativity, amazing courage, and the policy remains the same.